Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a conclusion of the reading the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics by Immanuel Kant. And if you've made it this far, congratulations. You've now read more Kant than any sane person probably should. But you've definitely have a firm grounding in modern philosophy because, as I'm sure you're now aware, having read through this, Kant he's like a tour de force of the foundations of pretty much all contemporary philosophy. So why is he important? Why did we read all this? And what's his implications for where we are today? So first, again, he provides an absolutely damning critique of metaphysics, which really is the sort of mix of Neoplatonist and theocratic thinking that had dominated human thought really for millennia. Indeed, one of the big distinctions between the Western tradition and sort of like the Islamic tradition is that the Islamic tradition has never broken out of the domination of sort of metaphysical thinking, whereas because of critiques like Kant, not just Kant, but Kant was certainly instrumental in this, he really didn't just defeat the idea of Christian metaphysics, he just really cut the legs out from underneath all metaphysics. So this is an astounding achievement in and of itself, that he really just demonstrates how problematic any approach to metaphysics is going to be, regardless of its origins or goals or purpose. And again, this basically takes the legs out from under Plato and everything that follows. So it really eliminates a whole bunch of the metaphysical foundations of Western philosophical thought up to Kant's time. However, he didn't just do that, not that that wouldn't have been impressive enough, but he also really weakens the foundations, one might even say destroys the foundations of both, as we mentioned, idealism and empiricism, which are the two modern philosophical schools, particularly empiricism, that we tend to take for granted, empiricism being the foundations of most scientific thinking, although not all. It doesn't have to have empirical foundations. However, that's generally how we approach it. And so, wow. So he turns to the past and says, well, what we've been doing is just silly. Let's stop doing that. And then he looks at the present and he says, you know what? Now also this idealism and empiricism, this isn't really helping all that much either. So let's redo all this. What he does with that is really problematic. In fact, scholars disagree again, how he deploys and moves away from this. So, but if we just pause for there a moment, and then we'll look at what he implies for today is if you have read this as you have now, anytime you encounter these silly debates about free will and determinism, notice that Kant provides actually several responses to this, none of which are generally taken into account, which means that most of these conversations about free will and determinism are just, they're not serious, they're unserious. There's no reason to pay attention to them because they aren't really trying to delve into philosophical questions. They have generally an ideological outlook which they want to promote, and they don't want to look at the difficulties or complexities that might underline this. But notice Kant undercuts both the arguments for free will and determinism, and then goes on to say, not only that, but they're not even mutually exclusive. So, and he kind of concludes with the notion that we can't even know. So he again, which is the one he actually believes is always, this is the tricky thing about Kant, but he provides very powerful arguments that say, look, free will is a wrong approach, and determinism is a wrong approach. And he says, in any case, we can't know. There's no way for us to have a reference point that would allow us to determine whether or not we have free will or determinism. And he says, even within that context, they're not mutually exclusive. And if you just think about that for a moment, how many arguments have you ever heard where the person says, is always giving you that either or? And Kant says it could be free will, it could be determinism, it could be that they're not mutually exclusive, it could be that we don't know, that's an unknowable, and it could be that both of those ideas are themselves deeply flawed and we should pay no attention to them. So he gives us 6 different approaches, not 2. Here's 6. Choose the ones you like best and argue from there, right? And so when you see these sorts of arguments, it's just silly. Or empirical arguments, right? Like science. Science has some access to truth, and Kant says, no, what empiricism gives you is an access to the limited amount of data you're able to acquire, but that obviously is limited by your capacity to collect data, your history, the context of human capacities, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not that science isn't useful or meaningful, it's just that it's not going to give you any sort of truth value, that this is where we kind of go wrong. It gives you utility value, yay for utility, we're very pro-utility. However, it doesn't give you a lot of truth value. And if you're trying to get truth, if you're trying to appeal to science for truth, you're probably barking up the wrong tree, as Kant would say. So, again, undercutting idealism, undercutting metaphysics, undercutting empiricism. What does that leave you with, however? When you've run through these arguments, when he's really hemmed us in, and the important thing that he keeps coming back to, and he develops this later, and this is crucial for something like his categorical imperative, is you're left with what the human itself is capable to experience and reflect on, including a priori categories that seem to be built into the necessity of how we experience the universe, and that we can use this to draw conclusions, that we can found a moral universe, a moral outlook, an ethical principle, not an absolute truth, it's a human truth, within the context of our own capacities, and we can extrapolate from there. And so the notion that every human is basically constructing a world for themselves, and then for both themselves and for the other people that they perceive, and that they should proceed this way, sort of the foundations of his thinking about the categorical imperative, is, by the way, categorical imperative, I should pause there for a moment, I apologize, and say, this is Kant's idea that we should only act in ways and behave in ways in which whatever we're doing ethically or behaviorally would apply for all people in all times. So that what we're doing is we're extrapolating from our own experiences, our own ideals, and our own concerns, and putting them on other people. So you don't want to torture someone because you wouldn't want someone to torture you, and therefore you wouldn't want torture to be available ever. Because this is, that is how would I want to behave in this circumstance? How would I want someone to behave for me? How would I want to feel if I were held captive? These kinds of ideals. And so this notion that the values that are valuable for you should be extended to and imagined as being on other people is an example of what happens when you take out the metaphysical underpinnings, i.e. theological underpinnings, when you take out these empirical and ideological and idealist underpinnings, and you go, well, what are you left with? Well, you're left with the human. And so you can read Kant as like the most humanist possible of all philosophers. Now, he had all kinds of problematic things to say about the state, and being in slavery is absolute servitude is the perfect form of freedom. I mean, I'm not saying that Kant is a perfect articulator of this, because he was always problematic. He was great at the critique, and then what he derived from those critiques was always just either hard to track down or problematic. So I don't want to let him off on that. But at the core function of what he does and what you can understand him is why he's important and why he's considered one of the founding thinkers of human rights law, et cetera, is because when you finish this critique, particularly when you have the critique of pure reason, what you're left with is the human. And so he wants to found everything on the human, from human experience, human societies, and not just human abstractly, but human individually. How can we behave as individuals that extrapolate out? How can we think as individuals that extrapolate out? What can we know that we can share? He's always, not in all of his works, but in the works we've been talking about, he really obsesses with this notion of the individual and what can be extrapolated out from there. Not from some sort of ideal picture of humanity, but from what we actually can experience as an individual. What is it that allows us to know or to do? Which brings us all the way back around to why a political leader who wants to blame Kant bizarrely for the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Well, here you go. Think about what's necessary ideologically, in this case, ideological thinking, for Putin to justify his invasion of Ukraine. Well, his Ukrainian invasion is justified in a couple of ways, all of which violate core principles and core ideals that Kant has just laid out. One, invading Ukraine is a expression of the cohesion of the quote-unquote Russian people. So there's this idea of Russianness or greater Russia or this amorphous ideological category, which is at best idealist and mostly just metaphysical. And you imagine this sort of, sketchy history, and you imagine some sort of shared resonance of language or culture or these sorts of things. And then you say, well, this gives the representatives of the Russian state, itself an abstraction, the right to go in and brutally invade and destroy and murder and kill and maim and do all of the rest in the name of this higher metaphysical ideological principle. So, one, Kant just doesn't allow this as a category of argument. You can't appeal to these metaphysical categories that he's already demonstrated. Like, no, there is no abstract. You can say there is a Russian state. Absolutely, that's a political and military, obviously, reality. He's not going to argue against that, but he's saying it does not have any metaphysical underpinnings. There is no greater narrative, and of course, the Russian nationalists all want there to be this bigger, destiny from God. All these sorts of things that underline this activity. It's not just brutal murder. It is destiny and uniting of a quote unquote peoples. Then there's the notion of, well, if Putin is able to do this and to organize a state to invade Ukraine, then why can't other states organize themselves and invade Russia? No. See, what Putin is able to do, Putin is not an individual like other individuals. He's a special individual, and he has special rights and special privileges and special opportunities. And he can do what he wants because he's representative of, again, this metaphysical principle, and he's the embodiment of, some spirit of the Russian nationalism and all this. And so it's fine for him to be this special category of person who can do these things. But no, you're not allowed to invade Russia the other direction. That would be very wrong indeed, and would make you a bad person. So, there's this notion of going, oh, no, what applies to me doesn't apply to you, that I get special rules, you get special rules. Kant really wants to work against that. He's like, no. Categorical imperatives suggest that if it is in fact okay for you to randomly invade your neighbors, then it's okay for your neighbors to randomly invade you, which of course Putin would vehemently reject. And so this is not viable. And indeed, what happens as soon as you get kind of stuck in your head, when you encounter these bizarre metaphysical arguments like, oh, some greater Russian people that have certain characteristics that they all share because of some magical force, then you just recognize sort of immediately like, oh, well, this is just this metaphysical error that people keep making and have been making for 1,000 years. And it's nonsense. And it's what Kant's helpful for is I know exactly why it's nonsense, right? There is no experiential underpinning of this. This is just an empty, vacuous category that you've created to fulfill other desires and needs that you have. But there's no way that this can have any merit as an argument in itself. And so I actually heard a Russian nationalist making these arguments about the Russian people and the character of the Russian people. And the person he was actually being conversation debate with Bernard-Henri Lévy, who I generally respect. But I didn't think Lévy was doing a good job of arguing against this sort of concept, the conceptual basis of this. He didn't just say, look, there is no such category as the Russian people. There are Russians, there are people who live in Russia, But Russia is in fact a multi-ethnic state, right? It's an imperial multi-ethnic state with all kinds of minority groups and so its history like completely defies this. It's an incoherent concept. Ukraine actually is a more coherent historical state than Russia, like any greater Russia could possibly be. So it's a bizarre use. And for some reason, people don't seem to mention this. I'm like, look, they're trying to deploy this clearly nonsensical and historically inaccurate metaphysical category to justify what is, of course, unjustifiable. But for some reason, people don't find that. And then this is the thing, once you've got Kant on board, you can go, oh, no, you're making an empirical argument that just doesn't hold up because I know the major critique of empiricism. So you either have to address that critique and how your argument does that, or I just don't need to pay it that much attention. And it's not that people aren't making decent points in various kinds when they're talking about empiricism or idealism, or you understand what they're doing, but it's like, no, you need to be really aware of sort of the limitations of this, or you need to argue against Kant, which people have been trying to do for a long time with not very much success, interestingly enough. So this is kind of the power it gives you. I think it gives you this sort of vaccination against a lot of nonsense, because you go, oh, well, this is just one of these categories that either we don't get access to or has already been thoroughly critiqued, and you're just not responding to it. And so this is why you can look at a later thinker like Karl Popper, who talked about, how does science work? And his theories, I mean, you can argue about his theories, but one of the things is he is responding to Kant. He's like, look, all we can do is just have things that really haven't been falsified yet. Right? This is what science is the not yet falsified, the field of the not yet falsified. And this is like the best we can hope for, but people did not like this argument, right? This was not a super popular kind of approach, even though he was kind of famous for various aspects of his thinking. But people were like, no, we can do better than just not yet falsified. And he's like, yeah, I don't think we can. I think we're pretty limited there. And so when you encounter these arguments from all kinds of different sides, I think Kant really helps you there. And he gives this foundation to the human. Like, because of the nature of our experiences, because of the limitations of the way our minds work and how it interacts with the universe, this is the best we can do. To be human, to embrace our human limitations, to recognize them, and use those as the foundations of our thinking. Right? So this is the prolegomena to any future metaphysics. He's saying embrace, figure out what you can do given the limits of the way our minds are constructed, given the limits of how we experience the universe, given the capacity that we have to reason and the capacity that we have to understand and to deploy evidence, but don't exaggerate them, and always keep within those bounds, because that's where good thinking can take place. And he argues powerfully that a lot of really great thinking can be done in here, and that the second you start violating these principles, you're less than nonsense, as he says. We're just making stuff up. And so when someone comes out and says, oh, he's responsible for the Ukrainian war, what they're saying is he's the one that tried to create a counter-argument. He's the one that started this notion that people matter, that the human is important, that the categories that want to destroy various people or things or entities like Ukraine are themselves invalid. But it's based on, to an extent that most people don't even recognize. And of course, it wasn't just Kant. I mean, there was a whole movement that got this done, but he's certainly very, very central and core to this, and has influenced basically everything that came after him. Is to say, no, people, maybe they do have rights. Maybe we should think about that. Maybe we should treat other people as if they have the same sorts of opportunities, notions, mental capacities, and interests and outlooks and abilities that we want or that we might have, and that we need to take that into account and we need to behave accordingly. And so something like the invasion of Ukraine becomes, would become, in this case, theoretically impossible, because there's no justification for it. And again, you could say, which is what the ancient world always said, the ancient world didn't come up with all these arguments. They just said, we're going to take it because we can. right? This is a very clear, non-abstract, non-ideological, just like, hey, we've got the force and we're going to take it. But notice this is different from trying to claim some sort of international legitimacy for one's actions, right? To do something horrible and say, hey, no, but we've got some metaphysical principle that allows us to behave this way, that makes it okay. I mean, this is the Inquisition, like, oh, we're going to torture you and maybe we'll burn you to death, but we're doing it for your own good, right? This is turns out that people are like, hey, really, that's what I don't perceive this as being my own. Well, it really is for your own good, because we have this metaphysical principle that we're going to apply, and it says, this is what's going to happen, but it's for your own good. And it's like, no, you can't do that anymore, or you're not supposed to be able to do that. And so this is why Kant is seen as, and why the prolegomena is seen as absolutely crucial to the rise of like modern human rights law, the modern human, even the concept of a global human set of personal rights that should be legally protected. I mean, this is really what Kant, when people try to draft these kinds of things, documents, what they're trying to do is come up with a global categorical imperative that says, hey, pretty much under all circumstances, for all people, no one really wants to be tortured, or if you're going to have to be thrown in jail, it should be humane, and all of these sorts of concepts, which the ancient world absolutely did not have. I mean, this was just nonsense. Nobody believed this, so it had to come from someplace, and a lot of that someplace is from Kant. So this is why he's still considered, in people, in these circles, like, as an enemy. He's an enemy of unbridled power, of metaphysical nonsense, of ideological crushing of the other peoples. And he was trying to work this out. And in so doing, he just really undercuts so much of the positivist and metaphysical and empiricistic and idealistic foundations of so much modern nonsense. And when you recognize that, and when you spend as much time as we have, thank you for writing along with me. I hope helped at least a little bit in making him clear. Then you say, oh, well, in the midst of all these difficult sentences and subtle arguments and, anachronistic constructions, there is actually a pretty coherent and very cogent critique of the human condition, and an attempt to say, hey, we can do great work, but we can only do it within these bounds. And when you go outside of those bounds, bad things tend to happen. So don't do that. So that's what I would say as we wrap up our reading of Kant. And so again, thanks very much for taking this trip with me. Several people contacted me when I said I wanted to do this and said, that's insane. Like, no one wants to read Immanuel Kant. And I said, that's probably true. but nonetheless, somebody did, and I appreciate it. And again, thanks to everybody who's signed up on Patreon, because that's great too. And I'll try to answer more questions, and we'll just keep having fun. So, Immanuel Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Hope that was helpful, and hope you're all thinking more clearly with the help of Immanuel Kant.